Okay, I'm just going to catch up with my slides. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about like a real brief history, because when we talk about Canadian labor history and just the amount of things that went on when you delve into it, I could have easily done a 4-day course on this. You know, and it's quite huge with the amount. So we're going to talk a little bit about it. We're going to take it really from really early in the game. And one of the things I want to start out with, just using the chat function that we have available to us. What I'd like you to do is, what do you think some of the changes were that came about because of labor history? Because what do you think some of the changes were that we see within Canada because of the labor movement? Just, if you can put that in the chat function, perfect.
So I see maternity leave, safety, 40-hour work week.
Perfect, that's it. Child labor laws, yeah, I love that.
Yeah. So better work conditions?
Yeah, better working conditions. All right. You know, so when we talk about this, go ahead, Kevin.
The bargaining units?
Yep.
Okay, so better.
Yeah, so I mean, there's so much that we can do and so much that we can talk about in doing this, that I think it really becomes incumbent upon us when we talk about it to look at it as a whole. And when we start talking about there was some years from about 1872 to about 1944, there was a lot of violence in the picket lines. There was a lot of violence in the labor movement. There was a lot of people martyred during that time and who gave up their lives for many different things. You know, so when I started doing a little research into it, I found it very difficult to pick and choose enough to keep it within the realms of my time limits and that. So I want to start out in about 1847. It seems like a really early year to be talking about the labor movement, but most employer relationships fell under a British act, and that was the Master-Servant Act. The laws were designed to regulate relationships between employers and employees during the 18th and 19th century. In 1823, the United Kingdom came up with this act, and the purpose of the act is to better the relations of servants, laborers, and working people. This was a huge act. It was a huge influencing act. The United States used this act in about 1945 or 1845. Australia did it in 1845. Canada brought it into effect in 1847. New Zealand was even using it in 1856, and South Africa was using it at the same time. The act generally was regarded as a bias towards employers. It was designed to discipline employees, all right, and repress the combination of workers and trade unions. This was the beginning when we started to make the big movements, and this was the beginning of the whole thing. And the law stated that you could not constrain trade, that you couldn't do that. So no matter what you did in forming a union, anything you participated in with that union was considered to be illegal. It required obedience and loyalty from servants to the contractor. Any infringement upon that, any kind of stepping out of the line, was punishable before court of law. So employers, they wouldn't take you to a labor board because there was no labor boards there, but they'd take you to the courts and they could throw you in jail for what you did. And they did that, and it was there. Workers had very few rights in the early years, all right? Very, very few, but it didn't stop them. It didn't stop them from collectively working towards change. Large movements went against the established laws, all right, under this act. So we're going to look at some of those important dates. So the first one I want to look at is the Toronto Topographical Union strike, all right, commonly known as the tile setters strike. So I have a poll on there, and I want to ask a question on that. So when do you think the first big strike happened in Canada?
So the poll is launched in front of you. Just go ahead and choose. If you've called in, the question is, the Toronto Typographical Union strike took place in what year? If you are not seeing the poll, the options are 1905, 1886, and 1872. So you can either pop that into the chat or unmute yourself and just call it the answer that you think it might be. Okay, we have 13 of 17, 14. Okay, I'll go ahead and end that poll and share the results.
All right, so looking at it then, all right, in 1872, all right, so this is really early. This is a type of action that gets you thrown in jail, and several people ended up in jail over that. The tile setters, these are the people who put the tile, the letters and that together for newsprint is what they did. The tile setters take up the cause at that time, and what they're looking for is they're looking for a nine-hour workday, right? They work 6 days a week. Well, 6 days a week, generally work 12 hours a day for the wages at that time, and they're saying, you know what, that's too much work. So we want to drop it down to a 9-hour day. And its demands for a shorter week are ignored, and a few weeks later, on April 14th, all right, they start a parade. They organize a parade in Toronto to show support for the strikers. 10,000 people participated in this. 10,000 people participated in the strike for one group of people. George Brown, he's a politician of the day, and he's an editor of the Toronto Globe, launches a legal action against it, against the striking workers. All right. At the time, union activity is still a criminal act of the Canadian Code. Brown has police arrest 24 members of the striking committee. The arrests are much protested, and the Prime Minister, John A. Macdonald's promises at that point, John A. Macdonald said, they're going to end these anti-union laws. So in 1872, because of the actions of these people and the risks they take to do it, all right, June 14th, 1872, they legalized unions. All right, so 1872, we can start to form a union, but you're not guaranteed recognition. Companies don't have to recognize you. They don't have to bargain with you, all right? And you still don't get the right to participate in the lawful activities of the union. So they say you can join, but you just can't participate in it. Companies don't have to negotiate, nor do you have the right to strike, all right? So this created a lot of unrest at the time, and you know, they're starting to demonstrate more, they're starting to get more into it, all right? They're starting to have more job action at this point, and the workers within Canada are starting to revolt and say, we've had our fill, all right? So in recognition for what they did, all right, we literally get a holiday out of it. So they moved from political action to social change at this point, and a holiday is created. I got another poll on that one. All right, we're gonna do a lot of polls tonight because I want to ask a lot of questions. So.
Okay, so the poll should pop up there. The question is, what holiday came in recognition of these strikers? So the options are August Civic Holiday, February Family Day, or Labor Day.
Labor Day?
Yeah, Labor Day. All right.
Great.
Perfect. 14 to 17, well, 15 because we had a phone in.
Yeah.
All
Can
right.
we just ask the person on the phone to identify themselves?
It's Lee Booth.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Lee. Okay, so end the poll, share the results.
Sure. So
Everyone agrees with Lee.
yeah. So in 1894 we actually get Labor Day. All right. Here's the thing about Labor Day though is Labor Day wasn't really set prior to that. It was we celebrated it. We moved it. It was happening in some parts of the world in May. Ottawa had it at one time. Toronto had it at another time. So it was going all around. Winnipeg had theirs, and they had it. So the origins of Labor Day trace back to about 1872 with the trial when tile setters went on strike. All right, and the protests that happened to release those 24 leaders in that, and the strike campaign for the 9-hour day. So that day that we call Labor Day actually turned out to be a day to free people. All right. It was at the time that it happened, there was a huge public support, all right, for the parades and the actions in that. And the authorities couldn't deny it anymore. And they had to realize that there was an important role trade unions were playing in the emerging Canadian society at that time. Trade unions were making a social change. They're making a change within society at that time. So a few months later, Ottawa gets one, and they pass it in the House of Commons. Sir John A. Macdonald passed it, all right, and he appeared before a gathering of people at that time and promised to repeal all Canadian laws against unions, and then didn't follow through. All right, so politically, people are making promises to us now at this point, and the changes is starting to happen. These are the people who really, they fought politically for pressuring governments for protections in health and safety. It was really important at that time to have that. They were starting to look at actions for that. And then in about 1914, we get our first view of workman's compensation in Canada. It came out of Ontario. The original workman, the whole concept of workman's compensation falls in the roots of Germany and the Otto von Bismarck in 1884. And he created what he called a worker sick fund. 30 years later, workman's compensation happens in Ontario. The Ontario labor movement was pivotal in bringing it in, pivotal in putting pressure on governments at that time to protect workers and that. Its principles are laid out by Meredith there, and during that time when he went and put the bill forth, and they're just as relevant as today. And he toured the United States and Europe and reviewed legislation, and what he said is there should be no fault compensation. Workers are paid benefits regardless of how they get injured. Security of benefits, the fund is established to do that. Collective liability, the employers and the share a liability for workplace injury. So we're starting to make this change. We're making employers accountable for what happens on the job. Independent administration of the whole thing, and it's exclusive. It says it's going to be there. These gains that you see came at a very big price, and some of the price people paid was with their lives in that. So a lot of strikes and a lot of things like that happen, but some of the strikes that we see are pretty monumental. Here, we'll launch another poll. When was Canada's first general strike declared? So this is the first time that we actually have a real general strike.
Anyone who cannot see the poll, the question, as Jim said, is when was Canada's first general strike declared? You have four options. So 1899, 1918, 1919, or 1945. So far, we've had 14 respond.
1918.
Okay, Lee's guessing 1918, or maybe Lee knows. All right.
All right.
End the poll, share the results.
On the poll. So here's the thing is 1918, everyone looks at it, that's a Winnipeg general strike. 1899 is a coal miner strike. 1945 is the Windsor auto strike. And in 1918, our first general strike happens, and it happens in Vancouver. In 1918, the general, it's the first one, it's the first big strike that happens in our history. And it was held in August of 1918. It was organized as a one-day political protest about against the killing of a draft dodger, an evader, and a labor activist. Albert Ginger Goodwin was his name. There's a monument in BC that you can go to, and you can see this monument to this worker who called for general strike in the event that any worker was drafted against their will during the war. The strike was met with violence from returned soldiers. They mobilized. They stormed the Labor Temple in Vancouver, which is on 411 Dunsmuir Street. That's present day. That's still standing. The building. It's 411 Senior Center now. 300 men ransacked the offices of the Vancouver trade laborers, and twice they attempted to throw the secretary treasurer out. Victor Mandley was the name. Twice they attempted to throw him out a window. All right. In response to this, opposition from business and middle class, the strikers, they walked off. They fought. It was really violent at times. There's pictures you can see where they're riding horses up stairwells to hit people with billy clubs and that. So what the government does of the day is they literally tear the unions apart. At that time, the Vancouver Trade Labor Council is there, the VTLC is there. They disband it and they forced another vote. All right, at the time, the delegates that they removed were on the ballots to get back in, and the vote count for the ballots was 117 to 1. All right, so they won overwhelmingly coming back in. After the strike that was forced onto them, it was really demoralizing at the time, but it demonstrated widespread support for the whole thing. This was the start of the pointing fingers of Bolshevik conspiracies. They weren't really called communists at that time. They were called Bolsheviks. All right, and this is where really started to get into it. The unrest was really deepening throughout the country. All right, and the following year, we have a general strike, and one of the most famous ones is the Winnipeg general strike. What makes Winnipeg even more so important was the Vancouver general strikes spread out to Burnaby, it spread out to Kamloops, and it spread out to surrounding places in BC, but it didn't really go across the board with the Winnipeg general strike. There were support strikes in Regina, there were support strikes in Toronto, in Ottawa, in St. John's, St. John, New Brunswick. There was support strikes in Vancouver. All right, so it really starts to build on that. So I'm going to ask a question about the Winnipeg general strike now, and we're going to. Who were the first workers to walk off the job in the general strike of 1919? All right, so your options are the building trade workers, the metal trade workers, all right, which is the foundry workers, and the telephone operators.
Telephone operators?
We've got some people guessing the building trade workers. Some have responded with metal trade workers. Lee's joining some others who have chosen the telephone operators. We'll give it another moment for others to respond. Okay, we'll end that poll and we'll share the results.
Good concept, telephone operators. I mean, it's true. Here's the reality behind the whole thing. Is the first to walk off were the Hello Girls. They were called Hello Girls because hello, I'm the telephone operator. They didn't show up to work at 7 a.m. The strike officially starts at 11, all right, with 12,000 unionized workers taking part, another 12,000 non-unionized workers joining in. When the police decide that they're going to get a coordinated attack to deal with the strike, what happens is the telephone operators are off and their numbers are very small and the phone lines all jam and they can't get through and they can't use that. So I think the important part when we look at that, we start talking about it, is you got to realize that these were probably the least protected group of people there were, and they had some of the biggest actions and some of the biggest effect on the strike. So how the strike works is May 2nd, the metal trade workers in the city's big three foundries, all right, walk off after fighting for years for higher wages, and they're fighting for that 40-hour work week, all right, that we all want to see now, all right, that 40-hour work week. But the biggest thing they're trying to do is they're fighting for recognition of the the Metal Trades Council as their bargaining agent. So they no longer want to bargain with just one foundry. They want to bargain with them all at the same time. So they're looking at that and they're saying, you know, like, you're cutting us up, you're working against us. We're going to band together. May 15th, the Winnipeg General Strike starts. The archives, all right, begins at the archives of Manitoba. So it starts there and they meet there and they strike. It ends in what they call a Bloody Sunday. And, you know, it's a very, very violent strike. It's probably one of the biggest strikes to make changes within the labor movement in Canada. All right. So they go into that and right after that, right after the war is done, we go into the Depression era. And during the Depression era, labor's hit very hard. We're hit very hard. No longer the jobs aren't there, the funds aren't there. Organizing becomes tougher, all right? And during those years, it becomes very hard as the people are single men are put into work camps. They're segregated from people. They're paid pittance for wages. All right. And finally, it gets to the point in 1935 where they've had enough. They've had enough of the unsafe working conditions. They've had enough of no access to medical care. They had enough of the shitty food. All right. So they band together in the West. It starts out in Vancouver and they say, we're going to march to Ottawa. And less beyond to Ottawa trek. Thousands of unemployed men protest and they pick up people. They start in Vancouver and every place they stop, people jump on the trains with them. And they're protesting the dismal conditions in the federal relief camps. All right. The men lived and worked in these camps and they got paid at that time 25 cents per day to do the work. No safety conditions, nothing like that. 25 cents a day to do it. And they started to walk out after 2 months of protest. Okay, they decided to do that. British Columbia camp strikers vote to begin their grievances to the federal government. The Great Depression has crippled the economy at this time and left 1 in 9 citizens on what they called relief. And it didn't come for free. You had to work within ditches. You had to work within the camps. All right. The Bennett government ordered the National Defense Department to organize work camps where single unemployed men were used to construct roads and other public works at a rate of 25 cents. The poor working conditions and living conditions led to the real big unrest. The unions step in. At that time, the big union was the Workers' Unity League. All right. They step in and they help to organize the men. In 1933, a strike's held in December. In 34, the men leave various camps to protest in Vancouver. All right, so it's not a short thing. This is over the period of time. All right, they return to the camps after a promise of government commission. When the commission doesn't happen and nothing is improving and nothing is getting better for them, in 1935, April 4th, they walk out. All right, they hop on the train. Their demands at this time was they wanted 50 cents an hour for unskilled labor, and they wanted union wages, all right, for the skilled, and at least 120 hours of work a month. All right, they wanted a provision of adequate first aid equipment in the camps. All right, and they wanted extension to the Workman's Compensation Act to include the camps, because at that time, if you got injured in the camp, you had no backing for it. You got nothing else, no help whatsoever. And they wanted to recognize democratic elected workers committees. All right, they wanted that right to strike. All right, which they wanted the right to vote on elections. And they wanted to remove the National Defense Department as overlooking these camps. All right, so they didn't want the Army being the ones to look at them, but they wanted municipal and federal governments to do this. All right, they decided to take the grievances to the federal court. All right, and they began boarding it, and this becomes the On to Ottawa March. It's the start now of really truly pressuring governments and doing that. So 1935 is happening. All right, we're starting to get the movement happens, and then the war starts. In 1939, Canada declares war on Germany. Women suddenly become the new workforce in Canada. They replace men who join the armed services. They start building our planes. They start working our factories. They start working our mills. All right, they are now the new workforce in Canada, but they don't receive the same wages as men. At the end of the war, the women are strongly encouraged to leave, and they're literally forced out of the workforce. All right, so that they can give the jobs to the men when they come back. 1921, 65% of all women worked in clerical or domestical services. Okay, during the war, all right, that number drops down to about 23%. The rest of them, all the people working in the workforce, are working in the factories. There's some famous things that come out of there. Anyone ever hear the name Rosie the Riveter? All right, so Rosie the Riveter is in there. All right, so when we look at that, Rosie, I want to ask you a question. Do you think Rosie the Riveter, there's another poll here for us, was Rosie the Riveter a real person?
True or false?
True.
All right. So Lee's voted for true, and I'll end the poll now. Most others have also agreed with Lee that Rosie the Riveter was a real person. Was she real, Jim?
Sure she was. And we had our own Rosie the Riveter. The Americans, I'll give the Americans credit. They made the fictional Rosie the Riveter famous during the Second World War, but Canada had its own female role model in a real person. Her name was Elsie McGill. Not only was she a role model during that time, during the war, and a poster girl and everything like that, she was the first woman in Canada to receive an electrical engineering degree, and the first female aircraft designer in the world. All right, she was 35 years old, an aeronautical engineer, and she supervised the production of the Hawker Hurricane fighters planes at the Canadian Car and Foundry Factory, and that employed at that time, so she supervised 200 women in production of more than 1,450 aircraft during that war. All right, she became a real symbol of Canada's miraculous economic wartime transformation. She was given subject in comic books. Queen of the Hurricane, she was called. She was larger than life. All right, retired. All right, and did an awful lot of good things for the labor movement at that time too, because she supported us during them times. That was a unionized plant. It was unionized because she never fought it, and I think that's really important to recognize, right? So, 1944, the war's going on. All this job action is being talked about. There's people withholding their services. the last thing we needed to do near the end of the war was have them strikes and things like that. So the Liberal government of the day enacted under the War Measures Act what they call PC 1003. After PC 1003 is enacted, we have recognition. So we moved from having to fight for recognition at this point to a company, when you form a union, forced to negotiate collective agreements with that union. So workers were given the right to join a trade union of their choice and to participate in its lawful activities. If you go into any labor act provincially, your labor code provincially, federally, you will find the wording in there that every worker has the right to join a trade union of their choice and participate in its lawful activities. That's where that statement comes from, and it comes from PC 1003. It protects our right to organize. It requires employers to recognize recognize union chosen by a majority of the workers. All right, this is an emergency war act. The Liberal government of the day extends it 2 years after the war to ensure labor stability and the transition to the peacetime economy. It then gets extended another 2 years after that, and then it starts provincially to be bought in. Saskatchewan's the first province to buy into it and bring it in. Ontario then follows suit, followed through by British Columbia. All right, and amazingly, followed in there by Alberta at that time. All right, it's far-reaching. It changes the whole effect of what we're doing. It suddenly says that unions have the right to discuss with workers. We've got the right actually to start fighting for other things than just recognition. All right. So locals across Canada pressure employers to negotiate binding contracts. This is the first time that we see contracts that have to be binding and they have to be upheld. The National Federation's Canadian Labour Congress is formed. The Trade Labour Congress is formed. So suddenly we're starting to grow, we're building our umbrella groups now, and we're starting to fall under larger groups of organized workers, and the labor movement's starting to grow. Our heyday for the labor movement was in the 50s in Canada, and in the 50s, we hit over 50% of the population in Canada belonging to trade unions at that time. It wasn't without strife though, because the Canadian Congress of Labor and the Trade Labor Council, they raided each other, they fought with each other, they feuded with each other. All right, and really that's what stopped the big growth for it. And that's where we get what we see now is the CLC, the Canadian Labour Congress. All right, the Canadian Labour Congress is the amalgamation of the two. All right, Quebec still stands outside. Quebec is not with that at this time. They come in later with it. The wars accomplished a lot for us. The war allowed us to grow in ways that we hadn't been able to grow before and got us into places. So I think when you look at this from 1944 back, those are the recognition years. That's when you were fighting to be recognized. That's when we're fighting to try and have employers work with us. We're fighting for the 40-hour work week at this time. We're fighting for safety at this time. And the IBEW is a real pivotal part of it. All right. So I got one more poll that I want to ask on this thing. And in that poll, what I'd like to ask is, what year was the first local formed in Canada? So that was the year we changed the name from the National Brotherhood of Electrical Workers to the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, when one of the locals received their charter.
So the options are 1899, 1905, 1895, 1916.
$18.99.
Okay, another $18.99 in there.
Mhm.
All right, are we ready for the
Okay.
answer?
We are. Here are the results.
$18.99. $18.99, Ottawa joins the NBEW. Ottawa joins in late summer, all right? They joined the IBEW. It's Local 91 of Ottawa. And in the spring of the following year, that local is defunct. All right, they couldn't keep their membership, so they rolled, but it was the start, and it brought the electrical workers organizing into Canada. We have, if you look across Canada, we've stretched across. We're in the railroad, we're in the government, we're in the shipyards, we're in manufacturing, we're in construction, we're in utilities, we're all over. And this is the beginning of the whole thing. So I think I want to end on just a note. I promised everybody I would do my best to try and end on time tonight. So I want you to watch this message because, you know, when we talk about all that labor movement has done, I think the biggest thing that they've done, you know, you talk about the 40-hour work week, you talk about health and safety, you talk about maternity leave, you talk about all of these things, and we find them rooted where? Where do we find the protections for those things now? In the laws, all right? So we created political change within there. And I think that's really important to realize that this is what we do. We become active and we create political change. So hopefully my sound's gonna work. I'm gonna give you a heads up. You control the volume on your computer. I can't control that, so if it comes through fairly loud, all right, just turn yours down. So I think when we talk about this, this is the fellow who did this is Derek Proser, all right, and you can find it on YouTube. They're 1-minute messages by the Canadian Labour Congress. But I agree with what he's saying. It's all through. If we look at the history of everything that we've done, all the changes that we've done, our fight's not come to an end. Our fight is still there. All right, so we're going to do a part 2 to this. All right. And the part 2 is going to be 1945 on, and we're going to talk about what changes happened during that time. I want to thank you very much. All right. I want to thank you very much for participating in this. I think I got a kudos because it's my first one that I'm ending on time. All right. So I want to thank you very much. I hope you get some value out of it. I hope there's some interesting points that are in there. I missed a whole lot, everybody. I really, truly did. There's a tremendous amount of history out there that we didn't even talk about. There's a tremendous amount of coal strikes that happened. There's a tremendous amount of deaths that happened. There's some murders that happened. There's a couple of lynchings that happened. This is just an overview of it and some things that I feel are very important to making changes. So I want to thank you very much for your time. And thank you very much for your interest in the whole thing.